It doesn't matter how many times I've gone overseas to film stories. Every time I've learned something new and I'm reminded of some truths. So today I want to share a couple of those things with you. As you may or may not know, I recently came back from a trip to Brazil where I was telling some stories with an organization called World Renewal. While I was there, I captured 2 different levels of footage. I've mentioned in the past, I'm a full-time filmmaker. I work as a full-time filmmaker, and so I've got some higher-end gear that I do use on some shoots, including some of these videos for my channel. In addition to capturing footage on that gear, I was capturing footage on my smartphone. Part of the reason I was there was to teach people how to tell stories on their smartphones. So naturally, I captured quite a bit of footage on that, and it's going to be showing up in the channel in the future. But while I was doing that, I was reminded of a couple truths and even learned a couple new lessons that I wanted to share with you guys. The first thing is you have to be flexible. Now, this is one of the things I mentioned in some of my pre-trip videos, but you're going to go on these trips and you're going to plan to tell certain stories, you're going to make plans of what you want to capture, but things aren't always going to go to plan. So one of the things that I was planning on capturing while I was there is they had recently put a new roof on an old community center. The thing that ended up being outside of my control, though, is because of conditions surrounding all the different teams that were going to be there, they had to do that a couple days prior to my arrival. It's kind of hard to capture something when you're not there. You might have a situation where there's an event going on that you're trying to cover, and you've got plans like, okay, I want to do an interview with this person, I want to capture this type of B-roll, and when the event starts, the person you wanted to interview ends up being busy and being pulled in 6 different directions, and your video ends up not being one of their directions. And then some of the B-roll you're planning on capturing, well, maybe some of the conditions, maybe the lighting in the space isn't what you would hope for. So naturally, you're gonna have to pivot and you're gonna have to find some other stories to tell and other ways to tell the main story that you're trying to tell. You gotta be flexible. Number 2 ties directly into number 1. Be open to telling new stories. So the really cool thing is, since I had an extra day open, I decided to tag along with one of the groups that I'd already tagged along with, go back into a village that we'd already gone into, and capture a little bit more footage there. But one of the really cool things is there was a girl in that village who had come to one of my classes, who was already telling stories well before I came into the country. And I was able to reconnect with her and hear a little bit more about the story of her as a storyteller. That's kind of redundant, I realize. But I was able to hear about how the stories that she had been telling had opened up new doors for her, had allowed her to make some really cool connections. So while I hadn't planned on telling that type of story, because I had this extra room in my schedule, I was able to capture that and really highlight what she was able to be doing. So looking forward to sharing that in the future. So number 3 is the importance of knowing your tools. The more you shoot with your gear, the more you shoot with your smartphone, the more you're going to learn how to best optimize it, how to get the best quality image out of it. And it's important that you do that when you're not on the spot, when you're not in a situation where it's like, I have to walk away with a usable story. One of the things I've learned in filmmaking is I learn by making mistakes. And I know a lot of other people do too. In fact, I was talking with a guy earlier today where he was saying that he was good at what he does now because he's already made all the mistakes that he needs to make and he knows what not to do. And that really resonated with me because there are so many times that I have made a mistake where I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to fix this. I'm going to have to figure out a way to get around that. Making videos for this channel, there's a lot of mistakes I've made, and I can promise you I will make a lot more. So this is kind of a twofold thing. I had mentioned beforehand that I was going to be testing out the Freewell variable ND filters, and I still plan to do a deep dive into them because there are some amazing aspects about them. But one of the things was I hadn't tested out the 6 to 9 stop filter. I had just purchased it right before the trip, and I wanted to see how it would work, if it was any better than the 4 and the 5 stop ND on the 1 to 5 stop. Because as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of a color cast in that. And I was curious, does the 6 to 9 have the same color cast? But I really wish I had tested that a little bit more beforehand, because there are definitely some shots that I got while I was over there that if I had tested that prior, I wouldn't have made some of the same mistakes I made. And there are a couple shots that just weren't as good as they could have been if I had realized, oh, I've got to have it here to optimize this filter. The second part of that is I was really diving into using the app Cinema P3 more than I'd ever used it before. I knew the basics of how it worked and a lot of the surface level functions of it, and I'd used it quite a bit, but I hadn't used it to where I was capturing full projects with it. And one of the things that I realized is, as I was using it, there were little things that I'm like, I wish they would address this and this and this. And then the more I dug into it, the more I realized, oh, if I go in here and make this setting change, then that's going to help me to overcome that. And if I tweak this setting, then that's going to fix that problem that I had. And so there's a lot of settings that I wish I had dug into a little bit deeper beforehand and really used it on a test run, because I wouldn't have had those headaches in the field, and I would have been able to more consistently use it to the optimal level. And so I plan to do a deep dive and an overview of that app in the future as well. But if I had known some of my tools beforehand, it would have saved me some headaches in the field. But the importance of knowing your tools when you're not in the middle of a situation where you have to deliver means that when you have to deliver, you're going to be able to just pull it out and excel with it. Number 4 is don't skimp on pre-production. I mentioned beforehand the importance of pre-production because that's where you're really going to figure out what the stories you're telling are and what you want to capture. My biggest regret, though, is that I wish I had a couple more conversations before the trip to really clarify a couple things, just to figure out like what would be the optimal things to get in the schedule to tell the stories. Because what I ended up doing was I filmed all of my storytelling content on the last day. I really wish I had captured some of that storytelling in the midst of the event, because then you have the environment helping to tell the story a little bit more. A lot of times when I do these types of videos, I like to be on the A-roll and the interview aspect as little as possible and show more through B-roll. So a lot of that will be alleviated because we're going to be in the B-roll most of the time anyways from the events. But there's something always really cool when your A-roll is also in the midst of it. For example, one of the things that happened over there was we were celebrating the 30th anniversary of World Renewal being in the country. It was a really cool event where tons of people came together, and you were able to see a physical example of what 30 years of impact looks like. And so I filmed an interview later on talking about the event, explaining what the event was, the significance of it, and all of that. But I really wish I had blocked out a little bit of time, or at least tried to block out a little bit of time, to where I filmed even a 60-second interview in the midst of the event. It may not have been possible. Like, it may have been one of those things that we plan ahead of time and then have to be flexible and be like, oh, we're gonna have to pivot that to another day. But I wish I had at least made more of an attempt to capture that the day of, just to tie it in a little bit more. A little more pre-production would have allowed for some of that to be planned in a little bit more. Number 5 is don't overpack. Now, before I went on the trip, I made a whole video showing you guys the types of gear that I was going to take. And I did take all of that gear. The problem is I also took some extra pieces of gear because in the back of my mind, I was worried that I wasn't going to have something I needed when I was over there. So, for instance, I packed, obviously, my mobile phone, my smartphone, as my smartphone camera. And then I also, because like I mentioned before, I'm a filmmaker, I packed my Blackmagic 6K Pro, which is what I film a lot of these videos on. But I recently purchased a Canon R6, and I just really wanted to play with it. Photography wasn't a key thing of my trip, but I was like, I really want to bring it. So I packed that as well. And I could have done without the still camera. So what I found is I ended up overpacking because I was paranoid that if A failed and B failed, sure, I had C, but really, in reality, what I should have done was figure, like, what are the necessities? Let me have some redundancy for the necessities. And then the things that are nice to haves, let me just make sure I have an A, maybe a B, and then don't worry about it from there. Because if both of those fail, then maybe I just go without. Finally, number 6, put the camera down. Make sure you're stepping away from the camera to be in the moment. This can be really hard to do because if you're in a role where you're a filmmaker, you're a storyteller, then you feel this need to continually get footage because, like, what if I don't have enough footage? Or what if there's a great moment that I don't capture because I was out of the moment then and it's just something I missed. But you shouldn't do that at the expense of experiencing the moments that are happening. When I was over there, there were some really cool moments where I just found that I needed to, I packed all my gear, but I needed to just put the camera down and experience the moment. So for instance, one of the things that we did is we went and visited the first church that they had planted. World Renewal is planting a couple churches over there, and we went and experienced a service in that church. I went initially intending to capture a little bit of footage there just to tell the story of what World Renewal is doing in the country. But once I got there, I realized it was more important for me to put the camera down and experience the moment and take it in and make that connection with World Renewal, as opposed to getting a little bit extra footage. I find if I don't put my camera down a couple times during an event or when I'm on a trip, I walk away from that event just it being a blur and not really remembering like what happened there, what was actually going on, and I get disconnected from the story. I get disconnected from the people that are involved. And so it is important to make sure you're not hiding behind the camera all the time and that you're not so wrapped up in capturing footage that you're not experiencing that moment. So I know this video has been a little bit different than what you've come to expect from the channel, but I wanted to share some of the things while it's still fresh in my mind. If you're interested in storytelling, if you're interested in filmmaking and using a smartphone to tell stories, make sure you like and subscribe. Like I said, in the next coming few weeks, I'm hoping to do a deep dive into Cinema P3. I'm gonna be doing a highlight of the variable ND system I was using while I was in Brazil, as well as a couple other things that I've got planned. So make sure you like, subscribe, and hang in there. But remember, a lot of, like we talked about today, it's not all about the gear, it's about the story.